Okay, so what we're going to look at today is dissociation curves. And so we're going to return back to this curve several times, but you really need to get to grips with what it means. So we'll just review this again. Along the x-axis, you have the partial pressure of oxygen. So what you've got here is values ranging from 0 all the way up to 100. Now, at the side here, you've got the saturation of hemoglobin. So this is where you've got a really high saturation of hemoglobin. That means there's loads of oxygen on there. So where it's at 100, that would mean all of the available hemoglobin has as much oxygen as it could possibly carry at that point. Down here, you have relatively low. So that would be, in this case, where the values are really low, that would mean all of the oxygen isn't associated to the red blood cells, to the hemoglobin, so it's come off. Right, the key things to establish here are what's the difference between up here and down here, and where is that happening? So, at really high partial pressures of oxygen, so at this point up here, we're talking about the lungs. So the lungs have an incredibly high partial pressure of oxygen because obviously that's where most of the oxygen is. And so therefore, at the lung, you're going to get a massively high amount of association of oxygen to the hemoglobin. All of the hemoglobin is going to be filled up with oxygen. Now, as you go further down here towards this end, then the partial pressure of the oxygen, okay, is more likely to be at lower values where the respiring tissues are. And the reason why that's so useful is it means that the oxygen that was associated, that was on the red blood cells, is now disassociated, so it's come off. And what that can mean is because it's disassociated from the red blood cells, it can now move across the membrane of the capillaries into the respiring cells that require it. So if it was still attached to the hemoglobin, still attached to the red blood cell, you wouldn't be able to get oxygen into the cells, which would be a problem. So think about it up here, high levels, that's at the lung, low levels here, that's what it's like at the tissues, at the respiring tissues. So, first of all, you would get the blood into the lungs, and because of the high partial pressures, lots of the oxygen will associate. Then as the blood gets pumped back to the heart and then back around to the respiring tissues, the partial pressure is dropping. Because remember that the red blood cells are being spread slightly thinner, and so the partial pressures are lower there, so it dissociates, so it comes off the red blood cells and makes its way into respiring tissues. Okay, so if you then consider that if it's at a lower level, it means that it can get into those tissues so that you can actively do respiration. Without the variation that you get there and there, you wouldn't be able to get enough oxygen into your cells to be able to respire with. So, what we're going to look at today is how this dissociation curve changes when you have different parameters. So, in this case, you've got the blue line that represents the normal line. And we have our red line, in this case, for somebody who's somebody that's undergoing exercise. So one of the things that affects this dissociation curve is exercise, and specifically the level of carbon dioxide. So what happens is you get a shift to the right. When you respire more, when the CO2 levels go up, that curve goes to the right, and we call that a Bohr shift, BOHR. Now, you're probably looking at thinking, what difference does that make? Now, it makes a huge difference here. It makes a huge difference because what it will mean at the same partial pressures, so we're going to pick on, let's say, a partial pressure of 5 kilopascals. Okay? At that value, what you've got for the dissociation curve for the exercise, the red, you can see that the percentage saturation is 40%. That means 60% of the oxygen has come off the red blood cell. And that's a massive advantage, isn't it? Think about it for a second. If it's come off the red blood cell, that will mean that more of it will be going into your tissues. If you compared that to the blue line, So the blue line is at 70% saturation. That means only 30% will come off. And so it means that this curve shifted to the right means that you can supply more oxygen at higher partial pressures to the respiring tissues. Now, if you pay a little bit of attention here to the values here, you would probably think, right, well, if I can apply more to respiring tissues, then won't it affect how much is getting onto the red blood cells in the lungs? And the answer to that is no. And the reason being is the partial pressure inside the lungs is much higher than this. So these values here, between 12, 13 and 14, these aren't the actual, in real terms, that isn't the partial pressure in the lungs. It's much higher than that. And so therefore, you're still loading the same amount of oxygen onto the red blood cell, and then when it gets to the tissues, it will unload at higher partial pressures or dissociate, which means you're going to supply more oxygen to the respiring tissues at those higher partial pressures, which is a massive advantage. So again, we would refer to this as the Bohr shift, and the principle behind it means that at higher partial pressures, more dissociation happens and therefore more oxygen to those respiring tissues. So you can see here, this you're going to probably get this as the example exam question, but it would be things like explain why it is that exercising tissues explain these types of curves, and it's always the same. The curve shifts to the right due to excess carbon dioxide levels, and therefore it means that dissociation happens at higher partial pressures, and therefore that means that the oxygen comes off the hemoglobin and is more likely to be supplied to the respiring tissues at higher partial pressures. And that's why this curve is so important. It means that when you start running harder, your cells get hold of more oxygen, which is obviously useful because you need it for respiration. In terms of some other examples here, so what we've got is fetal hemoglobin. So this is obviously in the fetus, and you can see here that this curve is shifted to the left. Now in this case, the reason why this is an advantage, it means that the fetus is obviously getting its oxygen from the mother, but it means that the fetus is able, in this case, is able to associate more oxygen at lower partial pressures. The critical thing, whenever you're looking at any of these graphs, if the curve is to the left, you want to be talking about association of the oxygen onto the red blood cells. If the curve's to the right, what you're talking about is disassociation at the respiring tissues. Now, if you stick to that, the chances are you'll tend to get the marks, you'll tend to get it. So look, this one, the fetal hemoglobin is shifted to the left. That means at lower partial pressures, it's taking on, or it's saturating more of the hemoglobin. So if we just take 6 here as an example, it's 80% here, it's 85 to 86% here. So it's able to take on more oxygen at lower partial pressures, and because the baby or the fetus is being supplied at lower partial pressures of oxygen, that's useful. Another example here is myoglobin, and so myoglobin, that's an example of a pigment found in the muscles, and this pigment has a really high affinity for oxygen, and what that will mean is that the myoglobin will physically take the oxygen from the hemoglobin that's carried in the blood, and what it means is the curve for hemoglobin and myoglobin is shifted to the left. So, and again, think about this, if the curve's to the left, you're talking about association of oxygen at lower partial pressures, and that's exactly what's going on here. The myoglobin will associate more oxygen at lower partial pressures, which will mean it will be able to take it off the hemoglobin and therefore supply the muscles with the oxygen. There's a bit of a note here, anything with myo on it tends to refer to things like muscles. But basically myoglobin is hemoglobin in muscles or in tissues in this case. Okay, in terms of tadpole and an adult frog, the difference here again, in the tadpole it's shifted to the left. And this shift to the left means that it will associate as a higher affinity for the oxygen, so it will associate the oxygen at lower partial pressures, taking more oxygen out of the water, which is a benefit for the tadpole. Another example of this, the classic example, is a lugworm. Lugworms are found on beaches. They tend to live in very low areas of oxygen, so low partial pressures. So in this case, curves to the left. Therefore, it will, in this case, associate oxygen at lower partial pressures. It will therefore have a higher affinity for oxygen, and because it lives in low oxygen concentrations, it can adhere more oxygen onto its red blood cells at those lower partial pressures, meaning that it can get more to its tissues. Another example of this is in llamas, so it's less pronounced than the lugworm, but the same is true. Llamas live at altitude, and so in this case, the llama's curve is shifted to the left for the human, so it means that it can associate more at lower partial pressures, and therefore, when it's up a mountain at lower partial pressures, its hemoglobin is able to associate more of the oxygen on there, and therefore it's going to be able to take more out of the air in effect. Okay, in terms of metabolic rate, now what we've got here is a curve for a shrew. Now the shrew is obviously much smaller than the human. Now for this organism, it's shifted to the right. So what you should be talking about, you should be referring to the fact that it's able to disassociate at a higher partial pressure. So in this case, the shrew is able to release more of the oxygen from its hemoglobin at higher partial pressures. And this means that if it disassociates at higher partial pressures, it means it's going to come off easier off the hemoglobin and therefore supply the tissues with more oxygen. Now, the top end isn't a problem here because the oxygen concentration in the atmosphere is much higher than these values, and so therefore at the top end it won't make a difference. It won't make any difference at the lung, but it will make all the difference at the tissue. So in terms of anything with a high metabolic rate, you would expect it shifted to the right, because metabolism being a series of reactions like respiration, then you would expect the curve to the right. And again, the words you're using are affinity for oxygen, so lower affinity, and therefore it's going to unload, it's going to dissociate the oxygen at higher partial pressures. Okay, hopefully that's been helpful.